Dan, welcome to the Personal Best podcast.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
How are you doing, first of all?
I'm actually really good, actually, yeah.
Good.
I'm in a very good place.
Amazing. Well, I really, really appreciate you being here because I know it's come about last minute, but I'm actually really excited to have a conversation today because I think we're going to cover so many important topics that I think will really help people. But I always like to start with the guest doing a little personal introduction. So for all the listeners, can you just tell me where you're from, what do you do, that kind of thing?
Yeah, of course. No, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm I've been following you for a while, so it's lovely to now be on the sofa and actually be on the other side of it.
Yeah.
I'm Dan. I'm an ultra running coach and strength and conditioning coach, mental health advocate who had a bit of a different start to life. I started my career after leaving uni, working in the city, trying to become an accountant. Hated almost every minute of it, and decided 3 years ago that I'd pursue a life that was more genuine and authentic to me. And that's sort of been my purpose and meaning for the last 3 years. And that's how we are here now.
I love that. That's such a good summary. Sometimes I think it's quite difficult to explain what you do, but that was great. And I really want to dig into, obviously, the journey that you've been on. And it's quite funny because I started this podcast, obviously, with the aim to help people live healthier, happier lives and become the best version of themselves. But in a way, one of the main themes that's come out of that is running and mental health and how the two actually go hand in hand. And I think your journey that you've been on is actually quite similar to a lot of the guests I've had on previously, which ties in quite nicely. So as you mentioned there, like you left university and you got into accountancy, but now you're a run coach. I wonder how you went from that to where you are now.
With a lot of difficulty and a big shift. So if I take you back to 2021, we're obviously about a year into the pandemic, and I've been working from home a lot during this time, and it sort of really put into perspective a lot of the things that I didn't like about my life and about my career, and it got me thinking like really heavily on this idea that life is really, really short. And I'd had some real struggles with my mental health over COVID. And when I came into 2021 and it just been past my birthday, I sort of had this moment of realization that life was way too short to keep doing something that I hated.
Yeah.
That I was trying to look for validation from other people. And I quit my job almost overnight with no real plan B. And I just threw myself into things that I thought I'd enjoy. I started saying yes to things and just trying to find some real hope in life. And community running was one of those things that gave me a lot of energy and a lot of hope. And I remember going down to a run club in Battersea Park in probably almost exactly 3 years ago now, and being terrified as I got through the gate. And then running 5 kilometers, it was such a simple thing. And like 5 kilometers isn't to be belittled, but I just went down there with an open mind and just loved it. And the conversations that I had in those 30 minutes of running around Battersea Park opened up my mind to this idea that connection with other humans is there. You just have to go looking for it, and you just have to lean into it. And from there, I sort of started to see running as this vehicle for meaningful human connection. So I did it more and I did it more and I did it more. And I got a little bit more invested in it, and I got a bit better at it. And the conversations that I was having was really fueling this desire to sort of change career. So over that period and that summer, the relationships that I made, the friendships that I made, what I learned fueled this desire to change career completely. And that's when I went to become a CrossFit coach, which was completely different to the city, but which gave me so much meaning and so much purpose.
I think that's amazing. And yeah, if we go back to that time in lockdown, I was actually reflecting on this the other day because I've recently been back to my family home, and it always makes me feel very nostalgic. And I sort of think about past versions of me. And even though I was at a very different stage of life, just leaving school, I was on a gap year, but then obviously my plans got ruined. It really made me question, like, what am I going to do with life now? I hadn't applied to university at that point. I thought, who do I want to be? What do I want to do? And I even hired a life coach.
Okay.
which is kind of laughable to think I was 20 years old and I was paying this life coach £50 an hour to basically tell me what I should do with my life. But I think because everything was sort of put on pause, people then had the space and the time to actually think about life and where they're at, if that makes sense. So I guess, what was that realization like for you, that you're in a job that you don't really like and perhaps you weren't fulfilled in that?
Massively. I think we've all been through similar experiences where we've picked paths that we sort of go down and we don't really know why we've picked them. And we're trying to either make people in our lives proud, get validation from elsewhere. And I had this realization when I was sat at my desk. I'd been working from home for the last 8 months. I couldn't see my friends. I couldn't do exercise in the way that I loved. I couldn't live life. And I was reduced down to my job, that I realized that there was no reason I was doing this job for me. And it was this really sobering realization that I was doing this for everybody else and that nobody else cared.
Yeah.
Like nobody thought any more or less of me. I wasn't going to get any sort of praise or validation. And in that moment, it sounds quite dramatic, but I just completely broke and like imploded
Yeah.
through this realization. And it sort of spiraled a little bit because I went back to like through university and like childhood, and there's just like this chain of reaction of trying to think like, what drives your decisions? Like, why do you do what you do? And it's easy to feel lost in that moment and not really know where to turn. So I spent a lot of time in therapy, life coaching as well. I went to
Yeah.
life coaching and worked on understanding what my values were, what my identity was, how I wanted to leave a mark on the world. And all of those learnings, and we sort of coined that term like doing the work, that introspection led me to sort of understand, okay, well, I want to help people. I believe in exercise being a great vehicle for people connecting to one another. I don't want to take a job purely based on money
Yeah.
ever again. And I want to try and have an impact. I didn't know how that was going to sort of manifest itself, but I just started seeing opportunity rather than being upset about the situation. And
Yeah.
that's not to say that everything is plain sailing when you sort of make that realization, but you sort of have this North Star that you keep following and thinking, okay, does this fill my heart up? And does this give me joy? And does this feel like something I should be going down? And like that's what I've pursued for the last 3 years, trying to find where I fit in the world when I'm making decisions rather than trying to please other people.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. And absolutely, I'm not trying to say that life coaching isn't helpful, because it is. I just think I should probably have just chilled out a bit during that time and realized I didn't need to have it all figured out at 20 years old or whatever. But yeah, I think it's interesting that for a lot of people, we attach our sense of self-worth to a job or a certain status. And often that means that we are going down a path that actually isn't what we really want to be doing. And I think it is really difficult because we often look for that approval from others, like you say. And something I've tried to learn on this journey of personal development is to not outsource my sense of self-worth to the crowd and do things for me instead. Would you say that you've also had that same realization from leaving the job?
Massively. I think it's easy to be really harsh on yourself. And I think in this modern age where productivity is everywhere, efficiency is everywhere, entrepreneurship is everywhere, it's so easy to be consumed by, I have to be doing more. And we just try and accumulate things that we do in our lives, whether it be career or personal life or hobbies. And very rarely do we stop and think, actually, does this make me happy?
Yeah.
And since leaving accountancy, I've given myself the opportunity and the permission to think, okay, now that I'm in the driving seat, rather than being in the back seat, being driven somewhere, I don't know where I'm ending up.
Yeah.
What do I enjoy? And it's a really confronting thing because when you're in the back seat, you can sort of outsource the agency to the person driving and just say, well, here are the excuses why it didn't work. This this person wanted this for me and this person didn't want that for me. And now you are the last line. So you have to decide that, which is really scary at the same time. And I can't underplay that there have been dozens, if not hundreds of days where I've been really uncertain about decisions that I've made. But now that I get to sort of take control of what I'm doing, it gives me so much more meaning and more purpose. And I think it's what I try and impart on people now is that your life is exactly what you want to make of it. And there are people in your life who want the best for you, but they are projecting what they think is best for you.
So true.
And I have those pressures like everybody else. And I've had to work really hard to communicate with people that I care about really deeply and say, I understand that you care for me and I understand that you want what's best for me, but it's not what I want for myself. And it makes you a better brother, a better boyfriend, a better son, a better husband, whatever it is, when you sort of lead with that vulnerability and you confront those conversations and say head on, like, look, I love you and I value your opinion. Let me try and explain to you why I don't want to do what you're suggesting and why this is more meaningful to me.
Yeah.
And that's a really difficult path to go down, but I would say that's probably one of the most rewarding sides of completely inverting your life is you get to lean into that discomfort and that vulnerability and that genuine sort of side to your life.
Yeah, definitely. And I think having that communication with people in your life is really important. And as you were talking there, I was thinking about a previous guest I had on called Daniel Dargan, which is one of my favourite episodes I've recorded.
He's wonderful. I watched the episode.
He's great.
Yeah.
Honestly, I wish I could have his energy every day. But he told the story that when he was leaving school, he had this idea that he wanted to be a pilot. And so he went to flight school, which was a big commitment and a big financial commitment. And at the same time, he was practicing behaviours that maybe weren't making him feel great, like going out, partying, drinking, all of that stuff. And he said that when you live a life that isn't really true to yourself, it starts to dig away at you and chip away at you. And for him, that culminated in him wanting to take his own life. And that was a really shocking thing to hear, because I then looked at him sat opposite me and we were having this conversation, and you wouldn't know, I guess, because he's now got this renewed sense for life and this charisma because he's living a life that aligns with him, and he's not trying to be Daniel that everyone thought he was. He's just being him, his true self. So I guess the question in that is, for you, what was the mental toll of being in a job or being in a situation that wasn't really serving you? Because it sounds like quite an easy decision to go, I'm just going to leave a job I don't like and pursue something else. But I'm sure it wasn't that easy at all.
It was anything but that. And it's important to sort of preface the fact that in the 6 months that led up to me quitting my job, I'd actually been signed off work. So I had a really intense panic attack at my desk working from home in October 2020. And I was signed off work afterwards with anxiety, panic disorder, depression, low mood.
Did you know you'd been dealing with those things?
I knew I'd bottled up a lot. And I knew that I didn't have an outlet to let it out and to communicate this. And I felt a really deep internal shame about not being able to cope. Because accountancy is a really interesting job. You start on day one and you start studying and working simultaneously.
Yeah.
But everybody around you who's more senior is confirmation that they've achieved what you're working to do. Because everybody's got their qualification.
You can see like the rungs of the
100%.
ladder.
So when you start finding it hard and you fail an exam and you're struggling because you're working weekends, it's very difficult to sort of find like real sympathy there because everybody else has been through it. And I didn't know how to sort of manage this, and I didn't want to sort of be the black sheep and saying like, I really don't enjoy this experience. But for those 6 months, I battled every single demon that I could ever expect to face in my life. There were days, and I talk about this example because it's such an apt way of putting it. There were days where I was fine, where I could function, where I thought that I'd made up the fact that I'd been struggling mentally. And there are days where I couldn't get off the sofa for 5 hours because I was crying. Days that I could do dishes, days that I couldn't, days that I could speak to family, days that I couldn't. And I had such an inconsistency in my mood that sort of by the time I got to my birthday, and this was like a really sobering point, I realized that if I stayed in my job, I probably wouldn't see my next one.
Yeah.
And it was at that moment that I sort of recognized that I could deal with the shame, I could deal with the embarrassment, I could deal with people's opinions, but I couldn't deal with staying in that job if I thought it was going to kill me. And it's this big thing when you leave your job because people congratulate you for leaving a job and choosing this path of authenticity. And I'm very quick to just say, it wasn't my decision. It was my decision, but it was made for me. It was made out of pure necessity in that moment. So I can really understand the sort of the mental toll it took on me. And that's why now I'm so open about that struggle and open about talking about men's mental health in general, how we find authenticity, how we find a genuine life, how we find vulnerability, because through that communication mechanism, we can ultimately, hopefully, change the sort of path that we're all on. And if we can get more people enjoying their lives in an authentic manner, then hopefully the world gets better as a result of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, even on this podcast, because I completely agree that there is so much vulnerability in connection. And I think it's good that we do open up these conversations. And it sounds like for you, leaving the job, that decision was made because the pain of staying the same was greater than the pain of change. But I also think that making that decision is quite scary and it can be quite a big leap. So how would you advise people to leave a situation that's maybe not serving them, even if the future is still looking very uncertain?
Yeah, I think it can't be underplayed, the pressure that leaving a life you know puts on you. And we can talk about sort of like the sunk cost fallacy, that you've stayed so long in a particular thing that leaving it seems really daunting.
Yeah.
And we can talk about the fact that authenticity is the only path for everybody and that we deserve that experience. If I could go back and give myself some advice, it would be what big tech giants do, and they call it fail fast. Is better to have invested £10 million and lost £10 million than invest £80 million and lose 80. So as soon as you realize that something isn't working for you, not that you don't like your job or that you've had a hard day or that life gets on top of you a little bit, but when you start to see it chip away at your character and your personality, I had so many opportunities in my 3.5 years as an accountant to turn my back on it. And I ignored every single one. And then eventually my body said, you can't do this anymore. So I would say, find somebody that you trust, speak to them very openly, lean into the vulnerability around that discussion, and believe that life gets better. I had no hope during that time as an accountant that life would get better. And it was only through leaving that job, leaving that career, leaning into a more connected life, that I truly started to believe that better days were around the corner. Because it's really overwhelming. You've invested a lot of time, you've invested a lot of like energy and commitment to something, and to turn your back on it feels like a real sense of failure. But failure now is something that I've completely shifted my relationship with.
Yeah.
I used to really be, so I used to say that the fear of failure used to outweigh the desire to succeed. So better to have never tried and never failed than try and fail.
Yeah.
And I completely shift that on its head now. So much so that with all my running, every single race that I do, I write Icarus on my wrist from the sort of like the mythology of the man who flew too close to the sun and got burned. But I flip it on its head and I say, do you know what? Nobody else ever got that close.
Yeah.
And better to have tried and failed and blown up in a race and it not go to plan than have never dared to try. And that's a version of myself that I couldn't have believed existed 3.5 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, it was inconceivable to me that I could have that mindset. That is really what it takes, because as soon as you lean into what makes you feel most yourself, I think that's when you get closest to understanding if something's right for you or wrong for you.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and I think often when we do have a big scary life decision to make, we sit on it for a long time. And, you know, sometimes you do need to reflect and weigh up options, but also the time that you are taking to make that decision, you're probably also festering feelings of anxiety and uncertainty. And, you know, that could apply to a job, but it could also apply to a relationship or something where you're sort of just dragging out the difficult stage. Whereas I really like that idea of fail fast, and also even if just taking the leap doesn't work out exactly how you planned, at least you've done it. At least you've explored a different path.
100%. I think it's so important to be adaptable.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many things that have shifted in the last 3 years, going from a very fixed mindset to a very growth orientated mindset, to being outcome orientated to process orientated. And I think there are very small changes, seemingly innocuous changes that you can make on a daily basis that in aggregate change how you view the world.
And
what
would you say those are for you?
For me, getting to, well, two of those is enjoying the process and seeing myself as an adaptable person, a dynamic person. So
Yes.
when things don't go your way on any given day, rather than react with anger or resentment, I now challenge the behavior. And I think, okay, what is this symptom trying to tell me? And by getting a better understanding of my emotions and how I communicate them, I can get a lot clearer with how I can communicate with vulnerability and authenticity with people. So it's always choosing the slightly harder decision. If something's made you upset and you can't let go of it, okay, I can acknowledge that now and say, do you know what? What you said the other day upset me. I just want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Rather than be that another brick that you put in the sort of things that you're holding on to. Is I talk about it now in sort of trying to let go of as much baggage as possible and trying to take as little baggage with me through life.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to feel as though my relationships, both professionally, romantically, platonically, are weighing me down. And I feel like by acknowledging them and working towards them, it gives me the opportunity to actually flow with life a lot better. So my relationships now with friends and family, like if I'm thinking about someone, I'll text them, even if they haven't replied to my last message, because I'm thinking it feels authentic to me. I'll text them saying, just thinking about you, just want to remind you that I love you.
Yeah.
And it's such a simple thing to actually be more present with your day to day. And as a result of that, you start to see opportunities in places that didn't exist before. You get to see parts of you that you didn't know existed before. And I think now this development in character, it doesn't happen overnight. It's one day after another, after another, after another. It's the sort of 3-year overnight change, which everybody sees now, and they take it for granted. And people undervalue what they can achieve in the long term, and they overvalue what they can achieve in the short term. I think patience and wisdom are two of the most useful character traits that I've developed over the last 3 years.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And again, to reference Daniel, he said on the podcast that your perspective is your prison or your power. And it's so true. And I think that's a really positive shift that you've made, and a shift that I hope other people can make in their own lives to live a more authentic life. But I really want to talk about how running's played a big part in this journey, because obviously you touched on it at the beginning about how you've left the accountancy job, you went to a few community run clubs, and now you're a qualified run coach. And I did write down a caption that you posted on Instagram, and you said that running's taught me how to be vulnerable, how to work for the things I want, how to suffer setbacks but not let them define me, how to push beyond perceived limits, explore different parts of the world, but above all else, it's given me a vehicle to develop meaningful connections. And I think that is such a beautiful summary of the power of running. But I do also know there'll be people listening who have maybe tried the sport, or they think about running and they're like, no way, I wouldn't want to do that. Why would I want to go and like put my trainers on and go for a jog outside? So it would be really great to talk about how you've sort of found running, how you got into it, and your relationship with it.
100%. And I think running is truly a miraculous sport for so many reasons. It could be done on your own, it could be done with people, it could be done in silence, it could be done chatting, it could be done in any way that you want it to be. And when I talk about running, the reason why I think it's such a good vehicle for connection is because when you're shoulder to shoulder with someone, you, one, are way more at ease. So you can have conversations with someone, and that feeling of judgment or that feeling of like nervousness isn't there. Second to that, when you're running, you're just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, not tripping over, and you can't filter your thoughts in the same way. And I mean that in the best possible way, because when you're having those thoughts and someone asks you how you are, when you're sat across from somebody in the pub or you're in a big group, it's very easy to say, I'm fine. Much harder to do that when you're running with someone one-on-one. So that's why, first and foremost, it's given me that vehicle for connection, because it allows me to break down my own barriers. And when vulnerability is reciprocated, you get to hold somebody else's thoughts as your own there and communicate with them. And it made me realize that we all have so much more in common than not.
Yeah.
And make no mistake, I didn't come to running as the sort of like predisposed person who would be good at it. I'm still nowhere near the level of other runners that in my circle that I know. But the lessons that it's taught me and the way that I can now become a better human as a result is I understand that you'll have setbacks when you run. Okay, I run probably more than most people. I openly say that 80%, probably 90% of my runs have a deep level of friction with getting out to run.
Yeah.
And it's my job. Okay, I get to coach people, which I love, to become better runners. But this morning I was out on a run. I was out on a longer run than you would do on a Friday morning. And a third of the way in, I thought, God almighty, I don't want to be doing this. And I said it out loud to myself. I literally swore out loud. I was like, I cannot be bothered to be doing this. But it just teaches you that if you just recommit, you take a second to calm yourself down, and you just keep putting one foot in front of the other, you are not your thoughts, and you don't have to be limited to what you thought you could achieve. And running is a one-size-fits-all sport. We're all different in the way that we approach it, but the way that I sort of talk about it is like, if you are between someone who's in a wheelchair and Usain Bolt, okay, it's a big scale.
It's a spectrum.
Okay, it's a huge spectrum. But if you're anywhere in between that and you can use your feet, you can call yourself a runner. And I think it's really, really sad that in this day and age, we sort of undervalue just running. It almost feels like there has to be a goal assigned to it, a distance assigned to it, a pace assigned to it. And it's a very big difference now with how I see running, because I see running as a vehicle for staying fit, a vehicle for exploring cool parts of the world, especially when I go trail running in foreign countries and marathons in foreign countries and stuff like that, and a vehicle for actually just deepening relationships. So there's nothing performance related about it. And I think that's one thing that's really important to sort of bring attention to, is that the reason why people quite often don't like running or don't find that love of running that a lot of people talk about is because they have a lot of expectation about how running should feel. You consume it online and you see people run and you think it's going to be a certain way. And Mo Gaudat puts it better than anybody could. It's sort of like unhappiness is the gap between expectation and reality.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And that applies to running as well. If you go into running with an open mind, thinking, I'm just going to go and see how it pans out, you can't really be disappointed. And if you keep doing that and you keep doing that and keep doing that, the chances are you'll start enjoying it a little bit more, because we enjoy what we're good at, and you will get better at it. And it won't be so out of breath, and you won't be as sweaty, and it won't be as hard. And then next thing you know, time has passed and you are a runner.
Yeah.
And I think that's the really meaningful part about the relationships, the connection, the longevity of setting yourself process orientated goals and just committing to something. Just commit to yourself and actually just turn up. Not all of them is going to be good, and that's okay. You just have to just try. You just have to try. And if running really isn't for you, then go find whatever is.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think that's really important, that you just sort of find the path that is meaningful to you.
But I think it's so great because, yeah, people might just look at it as a form of exercise and a way to, I don't know, get a bit fitter or burn calories or something. But for people like yourself, it is so much more than that. And I think the mental benefits are endless, really. And it is difficult when you get tied up, as you say, in the performance aspect, because I've been guilty of that so many times where I'm beating myself up because I didn't get a certain time or I didn't run that certain distance. But then when you have those runs where you just forget about all of that and, like you say, just put one foot in front of the other, you can get so much like mental clarity in that space. And also, like you say, it can be a solo sport or a community thing. And I love that there's so many run clubs now, especially in London, and different types of run clubs. Like I met, I had Selena on the podcast who does runners high, and Jenny's got runners and stunners, and they're for like slower runners. And I think that's great because there's no pressure. Even if it's like a walking pace, you can join. And I met a guy heading to a run club the other day, and it's a, what's it called? It's a run club for gay men. I can't remember. It had a really funny name, but I was like, I love that. I love that that's a community of people who are running. And I think if you can get involved in something like that, there's so many benefits because you're getting exercise, but it's social as well. And I really want to ask you how you sort of got into the ultra running side of things. So I know you've done a few marathons, a few ultra races. How did you land in that side of the sport?
It's a good question, because if I tell you the first time I ran a half marathon in 2016, I never, ever, ever in my life thought I'd ever run a meter further or a second faster. Okay. So I remember finishing that race, the Birmingham half marathon, and being utterly depleted.
Yeah.
And I kind of just ran for a bit of fun. But back in 2021, when I started to think that there was hope and there was optimism and that I could achieve more than I previously thought, that sort of fed this curiosity. And I think when we run, we learn so much about ourselves. And you can learn that on a short run or a long run. But I kept leaning into this curiosity of seeing where my mind would go. So I did a marathon. I thought, okay, that was the hardest thing I'd ever done at that point. And I was so proud of the achievement, which I think everybody should be. And then I thought, okay, why not I go do another marathon and see if it's a different experience? And I kept doing that. And then I sort of shifted my focus to, I feel like I'm doing a lot of road running and I'm getting sucked into this performance outlet from road running.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, why don't I see what it's like to run on trails? And I thought, okay, I'm curious about that. Let's go do that, because trail runners are a very, very different breed to road runners, because nobody cares how fast you go or what your time is. Nobody's ever finished an ultra marathon and asked somebody on the finish line or 5 minutes after or 10 minutes after, how fast did you go?
That's interesting, yeah.
It's such a different and very liberating space. So all of a sudden you realize that you don't get validation by running fast. You get understanding by the fact that you stepped onto the start line.
Yeah.
Because no ultra runner, whether they finish first or last, feels any different when they cross the line, because you all know that you've really gone to war with yourself. And then I sort of fed into that curiosity of going, okay, well, what can my body achieve? What can my mind achieve? And then we just sort of kept like snowballing. And that's what it is now, is like I keep signing up to things that scare me
Yeah.
and that excite me. And I'm so prepared every single time I step on a start line to not finish that race, even though I've trained for it, even though I've prepared for it. But that's really how we got into the ultra world and how it sort of snowballed from a 5K in Battersea Park to wanting to run a long, long way in comparison just by staying curious and enjoying it.
That's super interesting. And I had Lewis Roblin on the podcast, who I know you're friends with, and I found it interesting that he's gone from a professional rugby background to doing these ultra distances, and he explained that the difference in those two sports is that with ultra running, there isn't really any competition between people because the race is hard enough.
Yes.
And maybe, some people don't finish, or if you do finish, it's like, well done, you did that really hard thing. And there's just, everyone's like congratulating each other and like lifting each other up. But I think as well, an important lesson in that is doing things that scare you. And it's something I'm trying to do. I did a half marathon back in April, now signed up for a marathon because I need a challenge. And I guess that comes with having more of a growth mindset, as you touched on earlier, rather than a fixed mindset, oh, I can't do that, or I'm going to stay in my comfort zone. It's like, no, let me go out there and see what I can do and what I'm capable of. But I also think that's quite scary.
Massively, because you come out of your comfort zone, and when you complete something, it stops being scary.
Yeah,
like, I could do it.
Yes,
and you sort of expand into the size of your goals.
Yeah,
is how I like to think about it, because if you remember being sort of like 17, passing your driving test, it was the hardest thing you'd ever done at that point.
It took me 4 times.
Okay, it's a really traumatic experience. It's really hard. And
So
now
hard.
you get in the car and you can get from A to B without even thinking or remembering driving there at all. And the first time you did a half marathon, it's an overwhelmingly far, like long distance. And then you do a marathon, you're like, okay, I'm still here and I'm still functioning and I can give myself the credit that I deserve. And that's sort of where it spirals and it goes to, because Lewis's approach to it was he needed a wonderful outlet after professional sport and he wanted to throw himself head first into it. But Lewis will tell you that he's a very different ultra runner now than he was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And that's a real testament to the sport, because you realize that you're accepted as you are, rather than accepted for the time that you ran. And I think that's one of the most beautiful sort of acknowledgements that I've had from trail running and ultra running, is that, you know what, go for it. Sign up to something that scares you. If it doesn't go well, we'll pick each other back up. We'll sit in the mud together. We'll get up and we'll try again. I know people who have done the same race 6 times and DNF'd.
Really?
But go back and they go back and they go back. And it's just testament to this idea that I will keep working. I'm imperfect. I'm human. I fail. I fall. I get back up. I try again. And I think a lot of us stop too soon. And we do not give ourselves enough credit for what we can achieve. And if there's any advice that I'd give to anybody in running, you have never met your potential. Like, nobody, I think, has met their potential, apart from maybe Kipchoge. But everybody else is that you are so much more capable than you give yourself credit for.
Yeah.
And if you remove that fear of failure, you would see that. And I think it's one of the most beautiful things when you see someone cross the finish line of a race that they thought they couldn't do. And the elation that they feel, because it's exactly the same as what I felt my first race, and that some people will feel in their first race, to doing something that you've never done before. And I think it's such a shame to deprive yourself of that feeling.
I agree, definitely. And also that then applies to the rest of your life. And I watched the documentary that was made for the Why We Run event, and in that, one of the girls said, life makes you better at ultra running and ultra running makes you better at life. because you go into those races with everything you've learned from the training and whatever else has been going on in your life. And then you come out the other side with new perspectives and you've learned something about yourself. And like you say, if you go into a race that you didn't think you could do and you cross that finish line, what else can you achieve in the rest of your life?
100%. And Jen, who said that,
Yes.
is like it's such a powerful message, and it's so true, because there will never be a race that will act as a good proxy for your value as a human. Okay, there will never be a race that will make you more than you already are. But there are so many races that can teach you more about yourself that you can apply in your relationships.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the most pertinent points that you develop as you get into something and you grow with it. So running is this sort of like infinite sport. You can never complete it. And as you develop that awareness that actually, you know what, I'm better at communicating how I'm feeling. I'm better at understanding my emotions. I'm better at pushing through my perceived limits. I'm better at committing to a disciplined routine of training for this. I'm better at changing my mindset about what I think I can achieve. You apply those in life. And I remember when I used to coach at a gym in Vauxhall, saying to people, like, the exercise class is absolutely irrelevant. What you learn from about yourself here, when you leave those doors, is when it becomes important, because you learn things about yourself that you can apply in day-to-day life that make you better in all those connections and relationships. And that's really what ultra running means to so many of us. It gives us a better understanding of ourselves.
Do you know what? It's so true, because I don't know many people that have fitness as part of their life or run or gym or whatever it is who are shitty people. Do you know what I mean? Most people who incorporate exercise into their life and dedicate themselves to a sport, whatever that is, are pretty good, well-balanced, kind, motivated individuals.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But you did do a running challenge a couple of years ago that I want to just touch on and raise awareness about, because I think it's so impressive. And you, correct me if I'm wrong, you ran 4,369 kilometers in 2022.
That's right.
Would you mind just saying to the listeners why you did that and what was the meaning behind it?
Yeah, 100%. So if I take you back to that time where I was signed off work, I was very fortunate that I could afford to pay for talking therapy. I was so lucky. And I had this really sort of deep realization that the only reason that I was still here is because of the immense privilege that I was born into. I was born as a white male in the UK, and I had the money to pay for therapy. Now, I was on the NHS waiting list to get talking therapy, but it took me 4 months to get to the front of it. And 4 months during that period may as well have been light years. So I had this real guilt at the fact that I was still alive because of the fact that I was privileged. And I remember being on a run in sort of November 2021 with Lewis, and we were talking, and I sort of had this conversation with him. I was like, look, I feel like I want to give back. I need to find a way to change the narrative around men's mental health and do something that sort of symbolizes just how many men we lose to this invisible disease and entirely preventable cause of death. And he put me onto a charity called Big Moose. And we're talking, and Lewis is the kind of person that I could follow anywhere. We all have one of them in our lives. I don't need to know the details. I'll follow Lewis.
Yeah.
Because I believe in him and his character and what he stands for. And I had a chat with Jeff and Chloe, the two who set up Big Moose, father and daughter. And in 2022, I set out to run 12 kilometers a day for a year. So that's 84 kilometers a week for 52 weeks, because that's the number of men that die by suicide in the UK every year on average. And I decided to run 1 kilometer extra. And that was quite a symbolic kilometer, because it was for everybody who was still here.
Yeah.
Putting one foot in front of the other and choosing to keep going, even if it was walking through treacle or if it was plain sailing. It was just the embodiment of the fact that we all have grit and we all have resilience, and life is worth living. And through that year 2022, it kind of put into perspective just how many men die across a year. And it was amazing to sort of open up conversations around mental health, around men's mental health, around female mental health, around people checking in with each other and asking meaningful questions and having difficult conversations with it. And I raised money for the charity, who provide early intervention talking therapy for anyone in the country who needs it, and they'll put you in front of a therapist within 4 days.
Wow.
No questions asked whether you come from a privileged, underprivileged, ethnic minority, non-ethnic minority. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because they believe that it's everybody's right to feel as though life is worth living.
Yeah.
Which is, it really, really is. And it's amazing. And they're a great charity, a charity that I hope to raise a lot more money for going forward and be part of. And yeah, it was a really special year. It was really, really important to me that I do something that moves the needle, hopefully, in the right direction.
Definitely. Honestly, I have so much respect for that, and so much respect for anybody that puts themselves through these quite difficult challenges, but for a greater cause, and to raise awareness about important issues that matter a lot to people. And I think the idea that you ran the extra kilometre for everyone that's still here but maybe is still struggling is, like you say, very symbolic. And I think it's also an important message, because I realise quite often we have these conversations about mental health and it's like you've overcome something and we're in a difficult place, but now everything's fine. And actually that isn't the case with people who with everybody who deals with their mental health, right? You might have come over the worst of it, but there's always going to be days where you are in a low mood, or you're struggling with something, or something comes up from the past that reminds you that, it's all part of the journey. And I just want to sort of close on that message that I know you've shared, that we're all works in progress. And actually, as humans, we're not meant to have it all figured out. But if we can keep putting one foot in front of the other, then that is the best we can do.
That is all we can do.
Yeah.
And it's recognizing the imperfection that comes in your humanity, and knowing that you've never had it figured out, and life has always been chaos, and that if you just keep putting one foot in front of the other and trying to flow with life and finding what makes you smile, and recognizing the little things that really light up your life, maybe it's a life worth living by the end of it.
Yeah. I love that. But I am going to have to ask you the question I ask every guest as well, which is, if you had to give one piece of advice or share a quote or something to help people achieve their personal best, what would it be?
There's a quote, and I can't remember who it's by, but it's so impactful and meaningful to me. It's something that I tell my clients, and it goes something like this. It's like, don't climb the mountain so that the world can see you. Climb the mountain so that you can see the world. And it's so important to me that people choose why they do things. And I interpret that as saying, I'm going to do it for me, and I'm going to take decisions, and I'm going to take agency of my life. And because it's important to me, it's like, there is so much that you can do when you decide to take ownership and be vulnerable and authentic with life. And I think it's such an important message that there's nothing waiting for you at the top. There's no validation. There's nothing there. It's just decide to live your life for you. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll live the happy life.
I agree. I love that. Definitely. And it's something that I'm trying to do on this journey. I mean, I wanted to start a podcast, so I started a podcast, even though some people maybe didn't think it was a good idea, or feeds into so many aspects of our lives. But I think it's just so great to hear your story, and obviously the journey you've been on, because, I love having these conversations and sharing these positive messages, but when you tie in someone's personal experience, it makes so much sense. And I really hope that for everyone listening, they can then feel more hopeful about their own lives, knowing the journey that you've been on. And yeah, thank you so much for
It was my
having
pleasure.
this
It was my
conversation.
pleasure. It's so nice to be here with you and having this chat. And
Yeah.
I hope people can take something from it, that just because you're not where you want to be now, that you can't one day be a little bit closer to it.
Yeah.
And that in a year's time, you'll look back and you'll have achieved things that you never thought possible. And in 2 years' time, you'll think the exact same thing. And just keep chipping away at life.
Yeah.
'Cause it's worth it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And also, I might be doing a ultra running challenge later this year, so maybe I'll get in touch with some coaching. But lastly, where can people go if they want to find you, check out about coaching or anything?
Yeah, the best place is probably Instagram
Mm-hmm.
at Dan Sibal, spelled Sibal. That's where I'll post tips and my experiences, what I'm feeling, like what my training's like, bits about mental health, everything else in between. So it's probably the best place to actually see what I'm up to.
Yeah, I really would encourage people to follow, because sometimes I'll like read your captions and you've articulated something that I didn't even know I was thinking or feeling. So I really appreciate you putting that message out there. And thank you so much for today. It's been really great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.